I seem to be going down the path of empire videos. So here you go. Why the next global superpower isn't who you think. Couldn't have envisioned a more clickbaity title than that, huh? This is from the military show. Let's have some fun.
When the Berlin Wall fell, the US stood
start.
alone as the world's leading superpower, dominating in military, economic, and political spheres. Fast forward 15 years, and there's a new challenger in town. But it might not be who you think, and this shift in global power dynamics could turn our lives upside down, but not in a good way. Let's dive in and look at what's happening to shake up the world's status quo. To truly understand the power dynamics between the world's largest economies today, we need to rewind the clock all the way back to the Cold War and find out what really makes a superpower. In the mid-20th century, the two largest economies in the world were the Soviet Union and the United States. They were creating entire geopolitical blocks in their spheres of influence and guiding economies around them. This bipolar order was entrenched with the constant threat of nuclear war. This put the superpowers at odds with one another, as both sought to wield military power and dominate the economic, scientific, and military playgrounds of the world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia emerged as a shadow of its former economic and geopolitical self, pinning the blame for the New World Order on the West, particularly the United States. While countries such as Japan and Germany stayed in the relatively comfortable top 5 spots, it was the United States that truly won, remaining as one of the world's biggest economies and representing roughly a quarter of the entire world's total GDP. Due to the US having complete control over a huge chunk of the world's money, it could inject those funds into a peacekeeping, or rather peace-inducing, force abroad. There was no
the thing about the United States meddling in affairs outside of the US. Many times we're just faced with the idea that it's never really done for the reasons they might say, and always just conquering in some sense, or placing, not conquering, we're not conquering land because that's not what the US really has done, but basically replacing whatever regime is there with a friendly one to the US or something that will further its goal.
No other country that could field such a large military and transport it across the world as fast as the US.
Job at it,
this gave the world's sole superpower a truly global reach and the ability to influence others politically, ideologically, and economically. But the US largely failed in that mission, and for 3 key reasons. First, Russia was the biggest and most important successor to the Soviet Union, and it was kept firmly out of the US influence and the Western economy. Russia was stuck trying to bring back its former territorial glory, as evidenced by Russia continuously instigating conflicts in former Soviet countries and the overwhelming political and economic influence of both the US and the neighboring European Union. Ultimately, the country has made several grave tactical errors that culminated in the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a move that wiped 90% of its standing military and will likely set it back economically for the rest of the decade. Whether the West was truly responsible for Russia's downfall is up for debate, but what isn't is that the US was unable to stop Russia, despite Russia being outmatched by the US in virtually every way. The second aspect lies in
virtually every way. Wasn't it Russia that has the most nuclear weapons? I mean, that's just one aspect, right? It's a very political one, the one with Ukraine. It's just I'm not going to get into it because it's too complicated for this video.
China's economic and industrial leap at the start of the 21st century. The country was greatly helped by the economic influence and needs of the West. With rampant capitalism encouraging Western powers to seek lower manufacturing costs, China realized its potential as a major manufacturer, which allowed it to become the world's second largest economy by 2010. The US was under the belief that capitalistic tendencies would influence China to become more like Western nations, and in turn fall in line under the influence of the US. But the Chinese ultimately relinquished most of its ties to the West and tried to exert influence in its immediate vicinity and reclaim the territory it had previously lost. The growing conflict with Taiwan, where the US needs to keep a constant naval presence around the island China asserts is its own, has been a geopolitical sore point for China for decades. Other Indo-Pacific.
This is the craziest part, right? There's always it's just like a meme thing at this point, right? Where the US is right up against your country and then claiming you're the aggressor. And I get it. It's capturing influence, capturing spheres of influence. You wanna have that control in some sense. But this is what I spoke about in the other video, where the US is still young as a country in which it behaves a bit like a young adult. and always a bit bullying. It's a bit bullying. It's a bit too much. It doesn't know how to properly do diplomatic ties. Many people, I'm sure, would agree with me, and I could be very wrong. Let's be honest. I'm just an idiot on the internet. But it's just that this constant aggression or constant meddling with others just doesn't work long term. People will never want to tolerate that forever. And we're seeing a lot of that today, right? Because in the 90s, when I grew up, the US was number one in the mind. And a lot of Europeans now think the US is just simply a clown show. Arguably, I understand why. But at the same time, they just don't understand what's happening in the US and how Americans think here. It really is a bubble. It's in a way that when you live in the US, which I do at the moment, you don't really see the viewpoints of others outside of the US. You really don't. You're fed a narrative constantly in here. I really, yeah. And that's why things like when you go on TikTok and you start seeing things about Palestine, or everyone went to the Chinese app, Red Note it was, and started seeing the Chinese perspective, they start thinking, hey, what I've been told and what I'm seeing across the world is just not the same thing. And when you open people's eyes like that, it just really can never be taken back. It's almost like a broken wall, right? You just can't, and you can't rebuild it. You can't.
Pacific countries such as India, Japan, and Australia have begun relying on the US to keep the peace with China, forming an alliance called the Quad to counter it. But as China grows economically and becomes more independent of American trade, despite the two countries having more trade relations than ever, its new alliance with Russia might give China the latest push it needs to officially look into staking serious claims in its surroundings. Finally, while the US's goal was to bring democracy to other countries, its internal policies have all but led to the failure of democracy within its own borders. As the political system in the US became more and more favorable to the already rich, the wealth gap and income inequality in the country continued to increase. With the advancement of technology putting millions of Americans behind the curve as globalization makes them redundant, the US leaders are no longer the beacons of trust and hope for the common man. As such,
That's the biggest problem of the United States, in my opinion. The outlook from the average person in the US is just not good. And when you don't have a united people in the country, what are you going to try to build? When you ask people to protect the country, when you ask people to work harder for the country or be motivated to bring forth the American mindset or values or foundations, it's going to be met with hesitation. Because when it's asked of by politicians or whatever, people just don't trust any of this stuff anymore. They don't care about government in the same way. And the generation that did, i.e. like boomers and stuff, they're leaving. They're out of here soon. And what are we left with? An entire youth that sides with Palestine and doesn't give a flying F about what the US is currently saying, at least from politicians' viewpoint. Because the US, in my opinion, the foundation is so strong. It has great values. It has something really large to offer, but it's really tainted at the moment and quite corrupted. And unless that can be removed, the US really is just an empire that's going to fall. It still has a chance, in my opinion, but the debt, everything, these are incredibly difficult things to manage, incredibly difficult things to take back. So I'm a Westerner. I love the West. I want to see it succeed, just not in the current standing. It has to change. And I think a lot of people feel like that. It has to be for the average man to have a good life. What's a country for if not for that?
The US has made moves towards more insular management and isolation, as evidenced by pulling a bulk of its military forces out of the Middle East in the past few years without achieving its stated goals.
Yeah, well, who achieves the stated goals in the Middle East? Everything just gets destroyed and then no one wins and everyone returns. I mean, what the hell? There's probably some examples I wouldn't know of, but...
We can see the US is slowly but surely losing its status as the world's sole superpower. But what effects can we already see stemming from this change, and who is emerging as the next superpower? Mounting global issues, such as the crises in North Korea, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, are symptomatic of the problem of losing the US as the one global superpower. Now there are multiple countries exerting limited influence in their surroundings. However, even this is a simplification. In reality, there are three axes of the human experience where one or more countries or entities dominate. These separate and multipolar worlds are likely to carve out a new reality and could have significant ramifications for the global population moving forward. First, the security order is still being largely dominated by the US. While other countries have ramped up their military efforts, the US is still the one country that can deploy its soldiers virtually anywhere, at any time, and exert military pressure and influence globally.
Sure.
While other countries are mainly trying to shore up their immediate military influence, consider the next three biggest contenders on the list: China, India, and Russia. China has been making significant advancements in its military technology and has unveiled multiple projects to counter US air and naval power. However, the country's actual technology levels are still lagging severely behind the competition. Take the newest stealth fighter, the Chengdu J-20 or Mighty Dragon. Although the aircraft is purported to be China's answer to the fifth-generation fighters such as the American F-22 and F-35 or Russian Su-57, its actual capability is similar to fourth or earlier generations.
The difference is one has DEI fighters in it and the other doesn't. I'm just messing.
The J-20s were introduced at a time where NATO was actively getting rid of its fourth-generation aircraft by donating them to Ukraine and replacing them with American fifth-gens, which is consequently developing sixth-generation aircraft as we speak. Additionally, the US Marine Corps redesign planned to take effect in 2030 aims to directly refurbish that section of the US military force into semi-independent littoral combat units that can exert significant air and naval control over the islands in the South and East China Seas. This would mean that China can only realistically aim to control its immediate vicinity militarily. Furthermore, Beijing is already bordered by the other two most powerful militaries in the world, with India sure to pose a significant threat of its own. India has made great strides militarily due to its participation in the Quad, the strategic military dialogue that India participates in alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. The country has also passed China in total population and has experienced rapid technological and geopolitical.
I didn't know it was that close. That's insane. I was talking about this in the other video as well. It's just that's a lot of people.
Growth in recent years. As China moves to isolate itself against foreign influence, India has come to embrace it and will pose a serious security threat for China moving forward, especially as the two countries already have a bitter history over claims in the Himalayas. Finally, Russia's previous military might has largely been dismantled by its paltry efforts in the Ukrainian invasion. With 315,000 troops either killed or injured, Russia has lost a majority of its pre-invasion military capacity and is now being forced to rebuild. The country's economy is almost fully committed to the short-term goal of funding the war effort, as gas and oil exports to China are only a fraction of their full potential. As a result, the country is basically sitting at the mercy of China to maintain its finances and faces the significant threat of collapsing politically if or when its military does. For now, the United States will keep being the largest military force on the planet. However, the country can no longer use this as leverage for economic or socio-political alignment, which is where the second axis, the economy, comes in. Economically, the US and China are by far the biggest world economies, but neither has the capability to distance itself from the other. Despite waning political alliances, the two economies have only grown more intertwined over the years, hitting a record high in bilateral trade in 2022. The global market wants to utilize both American security and the rising Chinese economy, which has allowed for smaller markets to create zones that both countries have to fight over. For example, the European Union is by far the largest common market in the world, setting standards that global companies, whether from the US, China, or elsewhere, have to abide by to do business in Europe and reach lucrative EU trade deals.
Europe has too many rules, man. Too much bureaucracy.
However, India, Japan, and the Middle East are all significant players in the economic field.
Growing.
Take, for example, the proposed EU Middle East-India economic corridor that was announced at the 2023 G20 summit. Plans were proposed to create deeper economic ties between the three markets and bypass the bottleneck presented by the Suez Canal. Simultaneously,
Isn't that why Israel wants that for Greater Israel? You know how much money you'd make having that corridor?
The corridor is a direct threat to China's planned Belt and Road Initiative that targets these same markets. Consequently, the Middle East stands to gain the most from these plans, considering the two proposals not as opposites but as complementary economic incentives for the regions that could bring it up to par with other markets. The disparity between US security and economic influences in the world has been a sore point for the US in recent years, leading to flagging economic areas as potential security concerns. One of the first such decisions was the sweeping set of semiconductor export controls, which aimed to prevent US companies from using foreign manufacturing platforms. The move was ultimately designed to limit China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea from accessing US-born chips and technology. But most chip magnates have significant holdings in China and rely on the country's beneficial manufacturing climate. This means that the top chip companies will be forced between the US economic and political benefits or the Chinese manufacturing ones. Many industry leaders are now warning that this move could have negative ripple effects. Since China is still one of the largest chip markets, the reduced income from the export ban could impede US research funding and ultimately allow China to catch up in chip-making technology.
Even with this ban, they released DeepSeek. Sometimes these things just don't feel like they do anything. I mean, or a country like China must think of new ways to innovate, which they do all the time. All these sanctions, all these things, they feel like they just don't have the effect they're supposed to have. Again, I'm an idiot on the internet, but hey, it's what I'm seeing.
Even if that point is decades away. Another US government move that saw widespread media attention is the looming potential ban on TikTok for the American audience.
Yeah.
The social media platform is operated by a Chinese-owned company, and the US government wants to limit the influx of data from American users into China. While TikTok has roughly a year to comply with the law, which will almost undoubtedly be challenged in court and potentially delayed even.
I'm sorry, but the strong opinion here has got nothing to do with China, and it all has to do with the fact that you can criticize Israel and talk about Palestine. And as soon as it was taken down recently for, what was it, like 14 hours, and then Trump reinstated it, suddenly there were so many more rules or automatic reactions to people posting stuff like Free Palestine or something. So it definitely, it makes you question things, right? It's got very little to do with China having our data. We've already given it all. We all signed up for a red note. Who cares? They all have our stuff. Nobody cares, man. It's all going there. It's never really the thing they say it is, and that's why everyone's losing trust in what politicians say, because it just doesn't match what we're seeing.
And longer,
the
forever. Country's economy stands to lose significantly if the platform were to get banned. According to TikTok's own statistics, it's used by an estimated 7 million US businesses and over 150 million Americans.
Yeah.
Considering the severance of organic traffic to those companies, the US ban could cost the economy roughly $7 billion for companies alone. The ban could also stifle the growing influencer industry, creating a paradigm shift in American marketing. Other countries have lukewarm commitments to following the same standards as the US. While the EU aligns itself with some American proposals, its lack of unified military means that it stands more to gain by disentangling security and economic issues. As such, the economic world order would likely have multiple countries or economic entities, such as the EU, vying for more control as they try to ensure that the securities of the world's greatest powers can't dictate other countries' economic policies. So if a single country won't...
You know, I think he's right there. It's this idea that we have these isolated countries, in some sense, where they're starting to create rules as to what people can do in the country, where the world itself is becoming more global, at least online, and we should be able to interact with each other more freely. But when every country is doing its own form of gatekeeping or firewalls or whatever, we have this divisiveness between us all, when the average person will likely become friends with someone from China and America, for example, or even Russia or whatever. We'll find more in common than we'll find to be divided. And when all these countries are playing these political games, you wonder, why is that the case when we really just don't have a problem with each other? In fact, I think the average individual would like to see the common man succeed. Is that not the case? What do you think? Do you want the common man to succeed so that we can all have a better life and they can produce more so we can get more? and vice versa, that's just common good, right? But there's so many games in play, and they use, their reasoning can be good, maybe some of it is good, but I imagine a lot of it is just not good. And governments don't have a good record of doing what's right. I'm sorry. I'm obviously anti-establishment, you can tell probably. I believe in small government. That's what I believe in, small government, and let people adapt, let people do their thing.
To emerge as the world's next superpower
Am I
due to
wrong?
economic or military power, then what will
I'm
give
willing
them
to
the
be.
edge? Between the push and pull of these two world orders, a new one is emerging. It's the digital world order, and it's guided not by countries or governments, but by corporations.
That's
and
the
it could
worst
mean
one.
the effective end of borders or a complete reinforcement of them. The biggest technology
I guess my reaction is a bit too quick, huh? A world order based on whoever owns the best technology, that's kind of scary. At the same time, we haven't had it, so we don't know what it's going to be like. But this is like, I think someone in the comments even said this is straight cyberpunk. Here, no. Oh, it's somewhere. But someone was saying this is so basically we're getting into cyberpunk era, right? Here. So it's exactly what Shadowrun and the cyberpunk games were warning us about. Did you play the game? Is it exactly this?
companies have already been a turning point in the major conflicts of the 21st century. Consider their impact on the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO has been largely responsible for training the Ukrainian military and providing it with key equipment to physically defend its territory. However, without access to cybersecurity measures and modern communications devices provided by tech companies, Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian communications channels could leave Ukraine wide open and in the dark about Russian army movements. Some companies have suspended their operations and exports to Russia, preventing Moscow from being able to utilize vital resources and funding that the companies provide via taxes and expenditure. For example, Apple suspended map support and its payment platform in Russia and removed vital Russian news outlets from its app store outside of Russian territory. Google have also disabled live views of Ukrainian soil, hampering Russia's ability to access key targets. Even Chinese companies were largely ambivalent about the conflict or ended up siding with Ukraine. Without the tech company support, Ukraine might not have been able to turn what was meant to be a blitzkrieg into a prolonged war of attrition. And if Russia won the war single-handedly, the entire geopolitical situation between NATO, Russia and China would have been turned on its head. Russia could exert significant military and economic impact.
See, this is the thing. They all have this idea, or they push this narrative, that Russia just wants to continue west. When that's not what Putin has been alluding to. Could it be hidden? Sure. But this is just something that's it's another narrative to stand behind the West, right? When in fact no one has ever really, like the average person hasn't really listened to what Putin has to say. And I'm not standing with either, okay? So don't get me wrong on that.
Influence on Western Europe, keeping its economy focused
But
on
seeing a graph like this, basically, you look at this photo right here, and you think Russia's attacking Europe, like fully.
industrial and technological growth rather than military upkeep, and China might not have been able to leverage cheap Russian oil and gas, remaining dependent on US-monitored naval trade routes between the Suez and Strait of Malacca. But the reach of global tech companies goes beyond military efforts. Modern communication options are what allowed Donald Trump to mount a successful presidential campaign and speak in real time to millions of Americans about dropping out of NATO and imposing more isolationist policies. They allow people to come together and plan for government-toppling protests such as the January 2023 incursion on Capitol Hill, the trucker protests in Canada, the revolt in Brazil, or the anti-government protests in the formerly Soviet Kazakhstan. The tech companies effectively have the power to corral masses into unified action, directing the flow of information, or in many cases, disinformation, for their own goals. Tech companies now arguably have more control over major decisions in a country than its actual citizens, and can also directly control how users interact with the rest of the world through them. For example, major political campaigns can leverage enormous data pools that big tech companies have to target specific groups with precisely controlled political messaging and propaganda. Then those platforms can seamlessly curate the content shown to the user to create an echo chamber or a microenvironment that can reinforce existing beliefs or sway them towards the desired rhetoric. If successful, tech companies can effectively control how people vote and who they vote for. During the 2016 US presidential elections, the political consulting firm Cambridge Analytica acquired personal data from millions of Facebook users without consent. Worryingly, it was used to target American voters with political advertising, raising concerns about privacy and the ethical use of data in elections. This isn't only a...
I remember this, and this is just another type of political influence, or even mental warfare, man, whatever you want to call it. It never used to be this intricate. The whole world has changed so much with the internet and everything that's built upon it, that we don't know what we're really getting into and what type of games that can be played to get your way. And that's the dangerous part, because it's growing so quickly. We've went from having simple games online and simple websites to now growing into AI and AGI at some point, I don't know how long, where the game completely changes. It's going too quick. We can't follow as humans. That's probably why a lot of people are saying we need to have implants inside of us to even be able to keep up. I hate the idea, I'll be honest, but I kind of get it.
National issue, as international...
That's why I love Cyberpunk.
Companies often perform targeted propaganda attacks for foreign presidential campaigns. Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin admitted that Russia had been interfering with the US elections and would continue to do so. The main method of attack is through troll farms, groups of accounts specifically made to perpetuate a Russian-favored prerogative and disseminate it to US citizens.
Love it.
The tech companies that own the communication platforms used in these attacks often have little control or incentive to stop them until the problem is so widespread it impacts revenue or reputation. Considering the sheer scale of the attacks, it's highly likely that the problem just circulates between the most popular and effective platforms once they can figure out how to skirt their protective measures. Furthermore, tech companies are actively becoming some of the biggest players in the global economy, with market valuations in trillions, on par and in many cases larger than some countries. At the same time, the current political landscape in the US allows large corporations to avoid paying most of their federal income taxes. This means that the US government is losing tens of billions of dollars in tax income, putting significant strains on other sources of income, such as personal income taxation or smaller businesses, to make up for that loss. In fact, instead of paying corporate taxes, many corporations actively get tax breaks or government funding programs, creating an actual expense for the government. This
is I don't know the details, but this has probably been the case for a long time, man. And not just for tech, but some other business before that.
Additionally, corporations typically have much greater control over the American administrative and legal system. Corporate lobbying can actively redirect and impede the US government's efforts to control corporations within its borders. While a significant change would require a massive, one-sided effort from the American government, the current multifaceted lobbying system, with an incredibly competitive environment, makes enacting these changes difficult. Until the entire corporate system is overhauled, the US government will continue to increasingly favor the interests of large corporations such as tech companies over the needs of its citizens. These corporations...
See, that's the issue. And that's why there's another video I have lined up here, where it's basically about oligarchy, right? Someone else called it a plutocracy, but it really is just the people who have all this money, especially in tech, because that's where it is, it's not only, but that's where a lot of it is, are just starting to have such a grand influence that the average person doesn't have that much of a say anymore, unless you're combined in a certain unity, which none of us are, let's be honest.
Corporations likely have the resources necessary to hire adequate personnel who can navigate through the American legal system. In addition, they also regularly invest in academic research and think tanks that shape the intellectual environment in their industry to suit their interests. This means that tech companies effectively can take control over the country from the ground up. Beyond political control, tech companies have the power to shape people's minds and identities. The average American spends more than 1 hour a day on TikTok. The social media platform uses an algorithm to present content to the viewer. While the algorithm is supposedly using the user's history, there's no way for anyone to know how the content is actually placed into the user's feed without direct insight into the process. That means that the algorithm developed by a tech company can direct what part of the world's politics, ideology, or trends any given person is subjected to. The upcoming generation isn't being brought up entirely by their parents, peers, and the immediate environment.
100%.
Some studies suggest that children as young as 3 are being regularly exposed to social media, allowing tech companies significant influence on rearing the newest voters from a young age. Once exposed,
I think it's always really been like that, right? With school as well. You're able to just give them the information that you want from an early age, and you shape them to become something that benefits you. It's crazy long-term goal thinking. At the same time, this is why the break of the core family is a terrible thing, where you're able to influence within your home, where you can have a unique way of thinking and teach them critical thinking, which we're losing a lot of. And now it's very bad. You don't want iPad kids. And at the same time, I understand how difficult it is for a parent to not just throw an iPad at them. Hey, kids are annoying sometimes, let's be honest. But you don't want this thing where they're attached to the internet. And I only know this because I grew up without internet and then came into the internet. And I tell you, it's very difficult to not have it around you these days. You use it for everything, but that's obvious. And it was a beautiful thing not to have it in the past.
to this form of media
Are you born up in the 90s or before that? Do you remember the difference? Do you remember the transition and how quickly everything started changing? I literally remember that one day I would go out, and outside of my apartment building, there's kids playing football down on the street, and I was able to join easily. Or I'll see that my friends just walking around without parents. They're just walking around the neighborhood. And one day it just felt like it changed, one to the other. Suddenly there were no kids on that football field. Zero. Everyone's at home. That's always a saddening transition to think about for me. Not so much, the internet is great for many reasons, but the one thing that's really bad is it took us out of reality, out of the real world at times. I miss a good balance between them both, and I imagine that when we get into the extremes of using the internet too much, I feel a lot of people now are just not seeing it as important anymore. And maybe that's just a bias, because I know a lot of people are stuck on their phone all day, but also yearning for human connection. So there's this displacement now. It's an imbalance. Everyone's stuck online, but they want to just be around other humans. And I think this will continue to grow, this feeling.
Addictive by algorithms and trends, people brought up with constant access to technology will push to integrate it even more into their futures. This allows tech companies to remain perpetually in control over human lives.
Sure.
Overall, tech companies can make meaningful, civilization-changing decisions due to their ability to influence both local and international economics and geopolitics. This will likely lead to one of three possible scenarios. If the US and Chinese governments manage to wrest control over their corporations and the tech companies align their policies with their home governments, the world could see a scenario similar to the Cold War transfer to the digital sphere. Each country in the world will have to pick one of the select few major platforms and be completely inundated with its ideology while remaining relatively ignorant or wary of others. The digital fragmentation will be followed by economic and political shifts, reversing globalization and creating relatively independent areas of influence dominated by the US, China, or whichever country holds the headquarters for the next biggest tech company. Tech companies may forego this alignment and push for independent competition between the digital and physical spheres. They will look at global growth strategies in their own industry. In turn, the economic and security world orders will be joined by a globalized digital world order dominated by them. This will create competition between the country governments and the biggest corporations. Since geopolitics and profits typically go hand in hand, corporations likely would never be able to completely ignore governmental policies or international events. Furthermore, since corporations in the Western world have far more influence than in China, the digital world order would likely heavily impede upon the others. And this leads to the last possible scenario, in which the potential next global superpower emerges as tech companies actively overwhelm the local governments and control global economics.
Give us the answer.
It would lead to the digital sphere completely dominating the physical one, resulting in a new type of superpower, a potential global multipolar technocracy, where the tech companies effectively emulate physical governments. But should this come to pass, what would change? Interestingly, the actual effect it would have on the global economy is unlikely to be much different from the current situation, as it would change relatively little in the number of players and the key driving factors behind major policies. What real difference would it mean for the majority of the global population if power was split between the US and Chinese governments, or US and Chinese-based global corporations? Only time will tell. But what do you think? Can countries retain their status as superpowers independent of the major tech companies? What's the next world order going to look like? Leave a comment below to let us know what you think, and thanks for watching the video.
Thank you. All right, so that's the video, that why the next global superpower isn't who you think. But in the end, we were all looking for some tiny micronation to be the next superpower. And it's basically the same players, just in a different format, right? And I get it. We're getting this whole technology side into it, which is changing the game. It makes sense. They have a large influence on propaganda or human thinking. Let's read what people say. Preach! The only hope is an incorruptible government and a wise and united people. There are not many left. I think this is utopian thinking, at least at the moment. I don't see how this is. Things are so corrupt. Yes, it could change, but at the moment, this is not what we're seeing. A wise and united people. Where? You can fool some people some of the time, but you can't fool everybody all the time. Exactly, that's true. Every empire falls, all right. The commentator failed to pinpoint to us who the next superpower country could be. Yeah, exactly. He basically said what it could become rather than who it could be. Readers like myself listened with enthusiasm and expectation throughout, expecting to hear who the next superpower is. I imagine this person disliked this video. I like how you describe the U.S. military-industrial complex as peacekeeping. Exactly. This is why I said something. So still the U.S. Annoying clickbait title and thumbnail. Is the beast system? I don't know that. The machinery is sitting in the shop. Show crash. There's an error in the map, guys. Okay, just so you know. Look. I think this is the most accurate one here, right here. It's exactly what Shadowrun and the Cyberpunk games were warning us about. The way they explain it is just corrupted government with tech involved. And people who run the biggest tech industry are corrupted in themselves and only further the interest of the company. Here, so corporations are the next superpowers. Honestly, not surprised. Well, we all watched this video, so I'm going to put the link in the description. What do you think is going to happen? Where do you think it's going? What do you think the outcome is? We should all just use tech to become solar punk and just live on farms and use tech to help us. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Make sure the sunshine is out instead of creating clouds to block the sun. Man, the future looks crazy, brother. But we gotta remain with some form of hope. So while all this is happening, humanity continues, and all these stupid ideas, they come and go. Let's just be real. So you do what you can in your life to remain moral and ethical as much as you can, and be kind to one another. That's really the best. And in the end, these ideas, when the narrative is thrown at you so many times, you end up it just fades. Doesn't even matter anymore. The only reason it's annoying right now is because it's affecting our cost of living, our ability to get ahead, at least in the West, right? And that's something that we want to get rid of. The downfall of our lives in general, or the standard of our lives. At least I'm speaking for the West, right? Can't speak for everything. So, do something nice for someone today. And let me know what you did.